If you have your Bible and you want to just flip open to John 21, you know that we've been sort of living in John 21 these last couple of weeks. And so there's just a couple of pieces that have jumped out to me that I wanted to share. And so I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning and reference a little at the end, and then we'll kind of unpack together a little bit of something that's hitting me new and that's been kind of fun this week. So beginning of verse 1, after these things, now remember we said this is the PS, the rest of the story from now until forever. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We will go with you." Okay, so that's kind of the setup for this. They begin this fishing adventure. Then a little bit later in the chapter, we get a little bit of clarification. So once they get the big catch of fish in chapter 7, it says this, "That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on some clothes and jumped into the sea." Now, so we hear that little bit about the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then if you jump to the end of the chapter, you see a little bit more about that disciple as Jesus and the beloved disciple, or Jesus and the disciple whom Jesus loved, have this conversation. So hang on to that, keep that open. And I want to talk about those disciples in this final chapter that are named in John's gospel. The first one named is Simon Peter. Now, we know Simon Peter. We've been talking about him. He makes a big appearance here at the end of the gospel. The first thing that we know about Simon Peter, though, in John's gospel comes all the way back in the first chapter. And what happens is his brother Andrew is a follower of John the Baptist, a disciple of John the Baptist. One day, as they're walking along, John the Baptist says to Andrew, "Look, there is the Lamb of God," referencing Jesus. And with that's enough. Andrew goes, he gets his brother Simon, and he says, "Come, follow me, I've found the Messiah." So they go and they begin to follow Jesus. When they arrive, Jesus renames him, calls him Cephas, or Peter, which means rock. And that's the beginning of Peter's story. He's largely quiet through the rest of John's gospel till the latter part of it. And then he becomes a very vocal player. Now, why does that happen? I think there's a specific reason for that in John's gospel. If you've been following along, we said that John's gospel comes out of a very particular community. So they're kind of a group of people in exile that are fairly closely related to one another. And so that's where they come from. But around the world, slowly, there is spreading this message of Jesus Christ. And one of the central places that's happening is around Jerusalem, and it's Peter who is probably leading the charge there. And so I think part of why we hear so much about Peter here at the end of John's gospel is because it's explaining we're over here, and there are these other people over here, and yet we're a little bit different. But we come from the same place. We serve the same Lord. There's a connection between our communities, even though we live very separate and different realities from one another. So John mentions this bit, I think perhaps partially because of that. But there's more going on with Peter, and we'll spend some time with Peter next week because we know who Peter is, right? He's consistent in that he's not very consistent. He's bombastic, he is up and down, and he's very emotionally reactive. We've seen that in this latter part of John's gospel. We see it in his denial. And then we see Jesus reinstating him in this particular part of the story in the 21st chapter. That's what we'll dive into more next week. But Peter is this person on this sort of up and down roller coaster ride, and we're kind of invited to be a part of that. And he will become, from the midst of that, he will become a central pillar for the church. Jesus will use even him, who seems sometimes to be the last person to get it, who seems the most reactive, to become central in what God is going to continue to do through the church. And John wants to make sure to account for that. John wants to make sure to call our attention to that. Now, if Peter is bombastic and up and down and emotionally reactive, the next disciple that we run into, Thomas, is something totally different. Thomas, I think, is a realist. Thomas is practical. Thomas is concrete. He needs things that he can understand, that he can process, that he can hold on to. That's who Thomas is. Maybe the opposite, you would say, of Peter. Thoughtful, concrete, precise, wants to know, wants to be in control of things. Now, Thomas is another interesting character. The last time that we saw him was in the previous chapter where Jesus shows up the second time and allows him to see his wounds. And when we talked about that a few weeks ago, we said there are other times that we see Thomas. We see some of this concrete thinker, this desire for something that's definite and firm and that he can see. So we talked about a few weeks ago about the way that when Jesus declares that he's going back to the area of Jerusalem, something that Thomas and the other disciples can see is likely going to cost Jesus his life. It's Thomas who says, if he's going, we're going with him. And I think that's interesting because he's perhaps slow to understand what's happened post-resurrection, and yet we have this vision of him who, when he's set on something, when he understands something, he's all in. But he's still who he is. So later in the story, when Jesus says, I'm going to prepare a place for you at the Last Supper, and when I'm there, I'll bring you to myself. It's Thomas who says, well, how do we get there if we don't know where you're going? Ever the realist, can you give me directions? Can you send me an address? Can you help me find the way? He doesn't quite get it. Thomas, though, Thomas is perhaps like some of us. He wants things in the concrete. In the sort of Christian history or the legends of the early church planters, it's often thought that Thomas went to India to share the message of Christ. And if you want to look at a map in ancient times, that is a lot of miles to cover from where he was around Palestine to the east side of India. And to this day, there are people in India who consider themselves to be Christians who came to be so by the witness of St. Thomas. That's the power and the poignancy of his work of spreading the gospel. So you have bombastic, up and down, emotionally reactive Peter, and then you have this concrete realist in need of things that are certain in Thomas. And then you have these sons of Zebedee. Now, they don't get names in John's gospel. In fact, they don't show up anywhere in John's gospel until this point. So if we were only relying on John's gospel, we wouldn't know anything else about them, but we read in other stories that they are James and John. We read that their mother and their father are also followers of Jesus, that they're people of means, that they very likely were supporting the ministry that Jesus was doing and were in the broader group that were following him. We know that James and John are sometimes seen as among Jesus' closest disciples. And so they have this reputation of being around, and perhaps that's part of why John wants to include them here in this last chapter, even though we haven't heard anything from them. But they also had another reputation. They were called the Sons of Thunder. And they were called the Sons of Thunder because they had this habit of perhaps being a little bit brash, maybe prone to fighting from time to time, and more than a little bit boisterous. So in one of the other Gospels, there is this account as they're leaving a village that has been inhospitable to Jesus and the disciples. They say to him, Jesus, bring down fire and destroy this town. He doesn't. But you can see why they get this reputation of being perhaps a little bit angry. These are the ones who will come and ask to be at Jesus' right and left when he comes into his kingdom. Jesus asks if They think they can drink that cup. These ones are given to kind of push things to a fight. They seem to always be pushing on, and maybe that identifies with some of us, but here they're mentioned, and they're mentioned in church history, that perhaps one of them would become the first martyr one of the first martyrs of the church. One would be a planter next to Peter. This is who they are, these two, given to anger, to frustration, given to sort of maybe flying off the handle a little bit. And yet they're included there in the boat in the Sea of Galilee in John's 21st chapter. Isn't that interesting for us? Then you have Nathanael. Now, Nathanael is one of the bookends of the gospel. We've talked a lot about the connection between the last chapter and the first chapter. The last time we saw Nathanael was at the beginning, at chapter 1. That's when Philip came and got him and said, come and see this one who is the Messiah. When Nathanael asks about him, he says, well, it's Jesus of Nazareth. And his response, you know these words, can anything good come from Nazareth? I like the response, come and see. So he does, and when he comes up, Jesus says to him, here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. I appreciate that. That's how Jesus receives him, because Nathanael, for me, embodies somebody who's perhaps a bit snarky, sarcastic, maybe somebody who is a little bit skeptical of things. Jesus doesn't choose any of those descriptors. Jesus said, here's a man in whom there is no deceit. When Nathanael asks how he knows that, he says, I saw you while you were sitting under the fig tree. Nathanael's response is, surely you are the King of Israel. Here's what's interesting to me. In the midst of his cynicism and his snarkiness and perhaps his sarcasm, Jesus doesn't sort of skirt around it. He goes right through it. And that's what breaks down his defensiveness. And Jesus promises him after that, as you follow me, you will see greater things than this. All throughout the Gospel of John, Nathanael is seeing greater things than this as people are healed, as crowds begin to gather, as Jesus teaches about the life that is truly life and models what it means to live that way. And then you have this story where Nathanael makes an appearance again. And perhaps, friends, this is the fulfillment of that promise in the first chapter more so than anything else. Is there anything greater that one can see than the resurrected Christ? As he invites them to come and have breakfast on the Sea of Galilee that morning. So already we've got this interesting cast of characters, but perhaps none of them are more interesting than the disciple whom Jesus loved. I love that title. The disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, we've read about the disciple whom Jesus loved a few times. We know that later at the end of chapter 21, if you have that open, he says, I'm the one, he or she says, I'm the one who's written this book. I, the disciple whom Jesus loved, have testified to these things, so you know that they're true. Earlier, we saw the disciple whom Jesus loved sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper. You remember when Peter calls over and says, hey, ask Jesus, who's the one that's going to betray you? And Jesus and the disciple whom Jesus loved are leaning back with one another, and he asks him, and Jesus gives a somewhat cryptic answer. But notice that the author was apt to include that. Now, maybe there's something we can get about his personality. He seems to be relational. He seems to be particularly close to Jesus. And perhaps if he has built a community around himself in exile, out of which this story, the Gospel of John, is arising, that tells us a bit about who he is. But then we also see him post-resurrection. Mary has come from the tomb in the morning and said they've taken him away. So Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved run, and they do this foot race out to the tomb. And the disciple whom Jesus loved wants you to know that it was he who got there first. He won the race. Now Peter finally gets there, just coming along slowly. Finally gets in there, and Peter is the first one to go into the tomb. The disciple whom Jesus loved follows after him and says, immediately he believed. So if you're keeping track at home, oh wait, there's one more. Then that morning at the Sea of Galilee, when they have that big catch of fish here in the 21st chapter, it is the disciple whom Jesus loved who declares to Peter, it is the Lord. So if you're keeping track at home, he's faster than Peter. He was the first one to believe. He was sitting next to Jesus while they were at dinner, and he recognizes Jesus while they're on the Sea of Galilee. So maybe there's a bit of a ego issue somewhere as well. It wasn't uncommon for people to use pseudonyms for themselves in that time when they were writing about themselves, but I think it's funny, the pseudonym that he picks, the disciple whom Jesus loved, as if there was only one. So we have this character who is sort of draws people to himself and is confident, maybe to the point of being arrogant, and who also is poetic and extremely intelligent and lays out the story with all sorts of layers of intricacy and all of these themes drawn together. And that's one of the disciples that's in the mix in chapter 21. And then there's one other designation that's given. This is back in that first list of disciples. There are two that are called, and two other disciples. As if we're 21 chapters in, but now we need to hurry along and finish. As if we couldn't take time to name them, to write them down, to include them on the list. Perhaps these are the disciples who are overlooked. Perhaps these are the ones who don't seem to need to be named. Maybe these are the disciples that are consistently passed by. We know much about the future of these other disciples. We know how they fit into the Gospel of John. We know the work they will do for the early church. But we don't know anything about the two other disciples. And that strikes me as fascinating. When I was visiting seminaries, the one that I ended up going to, one of the things that stuck with me from my first visit, my first time ever being on campus, was a visit to their chapel. If you go to seminaries, most especially sort of mainline Protestant seminaries, so this is a Methodist seminary, they often have very large chapels. This one has beautiful stained glass, and it's very ornate. It's gorgeous and it's huge. And oftentimes those chapels are named after big donors to the institution, or they're named after people from church history who had a great significance throughout the ages, or maybe at a Methodist seminary they would be named after John Wesley, or one of the early founders of Methodism in America. That's usually how chapels get named. But this chapel is called the Chapel of the Unnamed Faithful. And I love that reminder that there are millions throughout the Christian history, millions of unnamed disciples, unnamed faithful, who have done what they could, who have given what they could, who have worked as they could, who have taken upon themselves the work of sharing the good news of Christ, of helping the world to find hope and joy and peace in Him, of helping the world to find reconciliation and new life and believe in the possibility of resurrection. The Chapel of the Unnamed Faithful. So when I think about all of this in the context of John's 21st chapter, I wonder if maybe what these two other disciples tell us is there's a place for those who feel looked over. There's a place for those who feel pushed out. There's a purpose and there's a role for those who feel like, maybe you feel like you've always been picked last for whatever reason. You've always felt like you're just on the fringes of community. You've always felt like you're just outside of the norm, like there's something not quite right. Maybe you can't quite name it. And I think what this tells you is that there's a place for you in this mission, in this ministry, and the possibility of what God is doing. That's what this 21st chapter is about. It's about what it means to be the church. And so if they're included in that short list, the unnamed disciples, maybe that means that it takes those people too to carry and spread and share the message of Christ in our world. Maybe if you're somebody who's been accused once or twice of being overly confident in yourself. Maybe if you're somebody who builds natural relationships with others. Maybe if you're somebody who would liken yourself as a poet, who considers yourself to connect things. Maybe the disciple whom Jesus loves reminds us that there's a place for you in this story as well. That there's work for us to do, that even this kind of person gets to be in the work that God is doing and the world is called to be a part of the mission and the ministry of the church in that first century and in our 21st century. Maybe if you're skeptical, sarcastic, cynical, maybe Nathaniel is a reminder for you that there's a place for you in this story. If your snarkiness has sometimes disqualified you from participating in things, maybe what we're seeing here is that there's a place for you in this ministry and this work, that you have a place to bring, you have gifts to share, you have something to be a part of the community, and that it takes all of us to do this work. Maybe that's what Nathaniel is telling us. Maybe if you've been prone to anger, if you're a bit reactive from time to time, maybe if you're rash and boisterous, maybe if you thought that disqualified you from being a part of the work of the church, maybe the sons of Zebedee are a reminder that that's not the case. Maybe that passion is intended to be used for what God is doing in the world right now. Maybe you aren't disqualified from ministry, but maybe God is calling you, particularly because of that, to be a part of it. Maybe if you're a concrete thinker, you want things in black and white. Maybe if you're all in for the things you can understand, but the things you can't understand, you're not sure about. Maybe if when pastors get up and they talk about spirituality and what it means to connect with something that we can't see, maybe if that feels really hard for you, there's still a place for you in this work, in this church, and what's going on. Maybe you have a role and a task, and maybe your presence is important in the work that we're continuing to do today. Or if you find yourself to be up and down, bombastic, emotionally reactive, when you're in, and when you're out, you're out. Maybe if, like Peter, you've been forgiven of much, there's much work to do. Or maybe if you need to forgive yourself of much, now is a time to do that. Peter provides for us a model of what it means to bring our whole emotional self into this. And so if you identify with Peter, there is a place for you in this story. Friends, there is a place for all of us in this story. What we see in the characters who are named here is that we all have a purpose, that the work that we're called to do of continuing to share the good news, of continuing to be the church, it requires all of us. It takes all kinds. Perhaps in John's gospel more than in any other. One of the interesting things that we see is that honestly, in some of these characters, there's not a lot of transformation. They are who they are. And Jesus doesn't seem to need them to change or be different from who they are to be a part of the ministry. I think Jesus works on us and invites us into new realities, but Jesus meets them where they are and calls them and invites them to find life in Him. And the same thing is true for you and I. What I want you to know is that there is a place for you in this work that God is continuing to do. There is a role for you in this work that God is continuing to do. There is a purpose for you here in the midst of what God is doing. All of us get to play a role in God's ongoing story. The question for us this morning is, are we willing to say yes? Are you? Amen.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to donate to the church, click the link below. For service times, campus locations, and any other info, you can visit graceumc.church.